Hi everyone, thank you very much for joining me. Today we're going to look at the Falklands conflict, which occurred in the first half of 1982, and we're going to examine how that changed Margaret Thatcher's popularity, and then we're going to look at was that a reason for Margaret Thatcher winning the 1983 general election. So before we go any further, I think it's important we understand exactly where the Falkland Islands are. Now, they're just off the coast of Argentina. They're actually about 8,000 miles away from us and are classed as a British overseas territory. Essentially, they would have been part of the empire. They would have been a colony. But what we call them today are British overseas territories. We need to understand why there is a dispute over the Falkland Islands. Now, the Falkland Islands had been a British colony all the way back to 1833. It had previously been owned by Spain. However, Spain had withdrawn from the Falkland Islands. Argentina had gained independence from Spain, and they said that they should have the Falkland Islands because it had been a Spanish colony previously and it was closer to Argentina. Therefore, it made sense it was part of Argentina. Britain, on the other hand, said no, they've been a British colony since 1833 and it should remain a British colony. The people there spoke English, there was a Union flag flying above the Falkland Islands, there were normal telephone boxes, police officers. Essentially, they followed very much the British way of life. So let's have a look at the timeline, events leading up to the Falklands conflict. Now, we know that when Margaret Thatcher got into power, one of the things she wanted to do was reduce public spending. And as part of that, there was a withdrawal of some defence forces from around the globe. As part of that process, in 1981, we see the withdrawal of HMS Endurance. Now, that was the last Royal Navy vessel that was serving, patrolling in that part of the world. Now, that withdrawal sent a message to Argentina. They felt that, well, if Britain aren't going to keep the Royal Navy in that region, perhaps they're not that interested in the Falkland Islands, or what they called the Las Malvinas. This withdrawal of the ship gave a signal to Argentina. Perhaps now was the time for them to perhaps take the Falkland Islands, because Britain did not want it anymore. And as a result, on the 1st of April 1982, Argentinian forces invade the Falkland Islands and they quickly defeat the very small contingent of Royal Marines that are based there. Some sources will say it's the 2nd of April. Essentially, it's on that evening, between the 1st and the 2nd of April. That's when the invasion of the Falkland Islands takes place. And it comes as a real shock to Margaret Thatcher. There had been some intelligence that it might happen, but nobody had taken it as credible. Now, it means Margaret Thatcher's got three options, and you can see these in front of you now. The first thing she could do is she could say, well, I'm going to leave it. I'm going to leave the Falkland Islands to the Argentinians. They're too far away, and fighting for them is going to be a huge risk. And I also have enough going on at home at the moment. And I want you to think about that. We've looked at the riots that have been taking place. We've looked at the economic problems that are taking place. So Margaret Thatcher has got a lot going on back in Britain. She could make a decision to try and negotiate with the Argentinians. Allows her to save face. She could say that Britain hasn't backed down, and it's a lot less risky. She doesn't have to send forces. Or she could fight back. She could say, no, I want to show that Britain isn't a pushover. We're going to show that I'm a strong leader. However, this is much higher risk. If she fails, she risks having her own Suez crisis. Don't forget, that cost Eden his place. If she doesn't succeed, she's unlikely to be able to remain as Prime Minister. So Thatcher balances up the arguments and makes a very bold decision. She decides she's going to take the Falklands back by force. At the same time, she's going to carry on negotiations. She will try and seek a diplomatic solution, but she's not going to shy away from sending troops to the Falkland Islands and taking them back from Argentina. This has a lot of public support. You can see the headline there from the Sun newspaper. It's war. A lot of people now start getting behind this patriotic spirit, this idea that we are going to fight back, we are going to keep the Union Jack flying, over part of what should rightfully be British. Prior to the invasion, very few people in Britain knew where the Falkland Islands were. Probably most didn't even know they existed. However, once the invasion takes place, there is a large swell of pride, there's a large swell of feeling that we should defend what is rightfully British and has a Union flag flying above it. Now, I've said that Margaret Thatcher carries on diplomatic attempts to resolve the situation. So I've shown you in front of you the three key areas. So first of all, with the United States, Reagan is really keen to find a peaceful solution. He's allies with both Britain and Argentina. Argentina is a key ally for him in South America, and so he doesn't want to lose that friendship. However, the Cold War is still going on, and America has been providing weapons to Britain, in particular a missile system called Sidewinder, which is going to be used during the Falklands War. So when it comes down to it, ultimately America sides with Britain. It's a very different situation to the Suez Crisis. Don't forget, way back then, America stepped away from Britain and wouldn't back them up. This time, America makes it clear that if it comes to conflict, America will side with Britain. They won't send soldiers, but they will make sure that people understand they are on Britain's side. Margaret Thatcher also goes to Europe. She goes to the European community, and the European community immediately side with Britain. They place sanctions on Argentina, so they're not buying products from Argentina, and products from Argentina aren't being imported or exported. France had previously been selling aircraft and weapons to Argentina, the Etendard and the Mirage jets, and the Exocet missile system. Now that caused a little bit of difficulty between France and Britain. However, France stopped selling weapons to Argentina as soon as the conflict started. And then finally we can look at the Commonwealth. And it's not really surprising that the Commonwealth sides with Britain and condemns the invasion. Again, they place sanctions on Argentina and they support British use of force. New Zealand and Australia helped slightly by taking over roles that the Royal Navy had been conducting within the Pacific Ocean and the Indian Ocean, which allows the Royal Navy to use ships in the Falkland Islands. But otherwise, nobody sends any other troops. This is solely going to be British troops defending or retaking the Falkland Islands. I've given you a quote here, which gives you a really good example of this support that Margaret Thatcher had gained, particularly from the European community. So just pause the screen. I'd like to read through this, but it's a good piece of evidence to show how Britain was stronger with Europe throughout this period. And then I want to return to the timeline. So we've got these diplomatic efforts continuing, and we're trying to build support and we're trying to find this peaceful solution. Britain has placed an exclusion zone around the Falkland Islands, and essentially this is a region around the Falkland Islands, and they've said to Argentina, if you put any ships in here, if you have any aircraft in here, we will attack them, they will be destroyed. So the message to the Argentinians is don't go into that area. They take it to mean that if you're outside the region, you're safe. Now we have an incident that takes place. And on the 2nd of May, Britain sinks an Argentinian battleship, the General Belgrano, and it's one of the largest battleships in the Argentine Navy. Results in the death of 323 sailors, but it's outside the exclusion zone. This comes as a real shock to Argentina. They didn't expect something like this to happen. Now, in Britain, you can see the newspaper headline from the Sun newspaper, and this great celebration almost that Britain has scored a victory, Britain has done well. So this really rallies national pride. But it puts an end to any chance of a peaceful solution. The whole incident involving the General Belgrano could be reviewed from many different angles. Britain would argue that we were at war with Argentina, it was a legitimate act. If they hadn't sunk that battleship, there was a risk it could have attacked our own ships, our aircraft carriers, and prevented us retaking the Falkland Islands. Argentinians would say that the ship was actually sailing away from the Falkland Islands at the time and didn't pose a threat. It's a difficult solution, it's a difficult one to look at. However, this really is a turning point in the whole situation. From this point onwards, it is going to be a conflict. There's going to be no peaceful solution. So, 2nd of May, the Argentine battleship General Belgrano has been sunk. 21st of May, British troops land on the Falkland Islands. And then through a series of battles, working their way across to the capital of the Falkland Islands, Port Stanley, they defeat the Argentine forces. I don't want to go into too much depth about the battle. However, you need to understand that by the 14th of June, the Falkland Islands have been retaken. The Union flag flying above there again, great jubilation in Britain and in the Falkland Islands. So what does this mean for Margaret Thatcher? And we've got this phrase, the Falklands Factor. I've shown you a very short, small graph which talks about voting intentions. Now, when you've got people being asked once a month, if there was an election today, who would you vote for? So I've gone for the same newspaper and the same polling company. And this was a poll that was appearing in the Daily Telegraph, and it was conducted by Gallup, and it was once a month they were conducting this poll. And you can see how this poll changes over time. So in February, we can see Labour are in lead. In March, they're getting closer. But once the Falkland Islands are invaded and Margaret Thatcher takes decisive action, you can see the Conservatives jump up in front. And it remains that way all the way through to the next election. I'm going to send you a link which will show you voting intentions from 79 all the way to 83, so you can see it in more detail. But it's really important you see that there's a clear split at that point, the Falkland Islands. So what's the Falkland Islands factor? Well, it increased popularity for Margaret Thatcher. She was seen as somebody who had successfully defended Britain. It causes this resurgence of national pride, this feeling of being Great Britain again, of having this increased standing globally. We had successfully defeated somebody else. And it also meant that America, and particularly President Reagan, were impressed at how we'd done that. This whole idea that we were able to defend our territory even though it was 8,000 miles away. It's worth noting at the same time, the Star Wars film The Empire Strikes Back had just been released, and American newspapers were running the headline, The Empire Strikes Back, when we were successfully defending the Falkland Islands. So there you've got it, the Falklands, and how that affects Margaret Thatcher's popularity and the 1983 general election. So I've got a question for you, and this is an essay that I want you to complete. You can see the title in front of you now. The Falklands was the most significant factor in Thatcher's 1983 election victory. Assess the validity of this view between 1979 and 1983. So a few points I want you to think about. It's really important, first of all, you only focus on 1979 to 1983. Don't go outside that time span. The question is very specific. There are three areas you could look at. The first one I would suggest you look at is the Falkland Islands. Look at how polls changed during that period. Think about national pride and Margaret Thatcher's popularity. You might want to consider the economy as well. Was that a factor in Margaret Thatcher's election victory? Consider unemployment, look at privatisation. However, don't start looking at deregulation or the Big Bang. That's 1986. That's outside the time span of this question. You might also want to start considering the opposition as well. Labour disunity, formation of the SDP, and a clear lack of Labour policy over this period. So we're bringing together everything we've looked at so far from Margaret Thatcher into this one essay. Now, a few general tips about your essay. Make sure you're backing your arguments up with detailed evidence, because that's the way you're going to move your answers on from being a bottom end of level 3 up to level 4. Quote from historians and those people involved at the time. This shows the wider reading, this shows the depth of understanding you'll have. And a general tip about writing your essay. Draft each paragraph as a standalone argument. Then proofread it. Quite often you're making some really basic errors in your written work, so the structure of the sentences doesn't read right, or there are basic spelling mistakes. We need to get rid of those at this point, so make sure you're proofreading your work a lot more. And then when you've finished that and you're happy with the paragraphs, start to put them together into the essay. Make sure that essay flows, so you're very clear in your argument. So there it is. We've looked at the Falkland Islands, we've considered how that changes the 1983 general election, and I now want you to write an essay putting together all the knowledge we've looked at over the last 4 or 5 lessons or so. If you've got any questions, get in touch. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.